Okay, so in this video we're going to be looking at the monopolies and their part of the market. And I think it's first of all important that we actually can define what a monopoly is. So it's a market with a single firm. They've actually got total control of the sales in the marketplace. And what counts as a market? Well, it's really important to be very specific here. So it could be argued that Gore-Tex have control of a market compared to waterproof fabrics in general, and the trains compared to public transport. So Anglia Abellio, for example, have a monopoly of trains from Norwich to London. What they don't have is a monopoly of the coaches there. If we think about geography, there could be a local ice cream seller who has a monopoly. He may be, say, on the pier and the only one on the pier, but there are still others in the area. And in fact, Anglia Abellio, there are other train services in the area which they have no involvement with, and we think about things like East Coast Trains. So the amount of market power can be limited by a number of close substitutes. So for example, if the train fares become too high, people start using the National Express coaches to London. So there can be a number of substitutes to reduce the amount of power held. Now there are barriers to actually enter monopolies, and we think of economies of scale and economies of scope, the product differentiation and loyalty, and the ownership of inputs and outputs. And to give you an example of inputs, people have got the capacity to control the market here. So De Beers, for example, have almost total control of the diamond mines and the diamond outlets. And then if we think about the outlets, well, Wall's Ice Cream, they often offer free ice cream refrigeration, but only to those actually stocking their product. And then we consider the legal protection, the patents, the copyrights. Now these are really important because they exist to protect people investing and developing new products. They're there to protect them and to encourage them to do this, and to have the opportunity of making back their costs spent on research and development. If we consider economies of scale, and this is something we consider in a separate video in more detail, as the activity increases, the costs fall. If we think of the marginal costs, we think of more activity, the more the costs fall. Now you do get situations in a small market where it might not be possible for two firms to operate profitably, and we consider this to be a natural monopoly. So for example, it could be local buses. Now there may be a natural monopoly for demand and routes, but it's actually only big enough for one company, not actually big enough for businesses to compete. So monopolists may be able to charge lower prices in order to force potential competitors out of the market. And if there's a risk of competition, they could reduce their price to stop the competitor from joining the market, and they would therefore have a much higher throughput. We think of the economies of scope, and then with this we think about the production of a range of specialist products, and again we discuss this on a separate video. We think about the shared costs in the manufacturing, research, and human resources, and if we look at pharmaceutical for an example, so actually the costs of one product can be shared throughout the entire company. So actually they may have a monopoly because of this, and new entrants don't actually have these advantages. And there's likely to be huge overheads for research and development and for testing. So costs are likely to be higher and prices have to be higher. So existing companies actually undertake research, and they can carry out this and obtain and undercut the prices. Now the scope does limit new entrants to the market because frankly it's just too much work, and the costs are far too high for small companies to be able to enter the marketplace. If we look at product differentiation and loyalty, now vacuum cleaners is not a monopoly now, but often there's this association between the brand name, which is so associated with a particular product, and it limits the opportunities for others. And you can see, for example, I've got the image up of Hoover, because all people used to refer to vacuum cleaners were, is they would say the Hoover. And I got examples to say Xerox. All photocopiers were Xerox, and all cornflakes were Kellogg's, and Coke. But none of these are actually monopolies now, but they all were very effectively in the past. There's this huge brand association between things, but the power does dwindle over time, and new brands come, but they generally come with a differentiation for the product. So there's lots of vacuums, but people still often refer to them as Hoovers. If we consider the operations of a monopoly, and companies with a monopoly do tend to charge a higher price than those in a competitive market. And if we think about our elasticity we've been discussing, the demand curve is highly inelastic, and it reduces the incentive to reduce costs to sell goods. But it is also important to remember that by cutting the price may not necessarily see the demand increase. Barriers to new entrants reduce the requirement to compete on price or value. So if there's no need, there's less incentive, so the costs remain high and the price remain high. But this could actually be bad for the consumer. So you could have an example of train service with very high costs to the consumer offering a very poor service. So there's less incentive to be efficient, high costs, high prices. And if we think about the operation of the monopoly again, the cost of operation may be lower, we have the economies of scale, we have centralised costs and services, and it avoids duplication of things like water mains, which customers have to have. So actually, there's an argument we do actually need a monopoly, because if you can imagine, if every single house had a whole variety of infrastructure, say water mains coming in, which inevitably the customer would have to pay for. There's the opportunities for profits, which could be created, and that gives them the ability to reinvest and to redevelop and to continue their research and development. And they may be liable to takeover. And I think about the GlaxoSmithKline in the pharmaceutical industry, who have been gradually taking over more and more small companies to actually increase their market share. So a monopoly is not always bad news for consumers, but it's not always good for supply.